So you're sitting there scrolling used car listings and you find the perfect JDM beauty, maybe a Skyline or Sylvia, and then bam, reality hits. You can't buy it, at least not easily, and the reason? Some French guy from the 1800s. And I wish it was a random French guy, it's Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, he is kind of why you're not cruising in that right-hand drive in port today. What sounds like some random quirk about driving on the left or on the right, it's actually not random at all. There's a whole story behind why steering wheels ended up on different sides around the world, and it involves sword fighting, samurai, knights on horseback, Napoleon's empire, Britain's stubborn pride, and Henry Ford's assembly line. I mean, Henry Ford's kinda, whatever. So let's break this down, because once you see how history made traffic direction a matter of conquest, culture, and industry, you'll understand exactly why your dream JDM feels so out of reach. Long before cars, people had to decide which side of the path to travel. And the choice was rarely just random preference, it was about safety and survival. Take Japan's samurai for example, they carried their swords on the left so they could draw them quickly with their right hand. Also, if two samurai were passing each other on the road, it made sense to keep to the left. This way their swords wouldn't clash together and possibly initiate a fight. The same logic applied in medieval Europe. Knights were right-handed for the most part, so facing opponents on the left side of the road made combat cleaner and exchanges safer. Whether it was jousting, duels, or just protection from bandits, staying left was the defensive practical choice. Over centuries, the left-hand tradition wasn't just cultural etiquette, it naturally evolved into the default lane for horseback travel. But then, the French Empire showed up and everything flipped. When Napoleon started expanding his empires across Europe, he didn't just change governments and borders, he redesigned the way people literally moved through the world. Part of his legacy was standardization, adopting one set of laws, one system of measures, and yes, one side of the road. He declared everyone under French influence a right-side driver. Now the reason is ambiguous and historians still debate it. Some say it was practical, because Napoleon's armies were massive and keeping troops marching on the right helped organize supply convoys more efficiently. Others thought it was political theater, some kind of rebellious stunt against the British, which was their great rival of the time and firmly left-hand oriented. Whatever the core motivation, once Napoleon imposed it, right-hand traffic became more than regulation. It was the modern continental identity. Through his conquest in Europe, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, Italy all flipped to conform to the new system. Traveling on the right was marketed almost as progress, as a symbol of breaking old feudal habits and embracing a rational, unified order. Of course, this wasn't just about soldiers walking information. Roads, carriages, and eventually the first motor cars on the continent were designed to fit this new normal. In turn, countries outside France that wanted to present themselves as being modern or connected to France's influence gradually followed. By the 19th century, if you were on mainland Europe, right-hand traffic was considered the standard way forward. This shift put Britain in a peculiar spot. Their colonial and military identity had always leaned left, and if they gave up that rule, it would look like they were bowing down to Napoleon's authority. And if there's one thing Britain wasn't going to do, it was to bend to a French emperor all right. Horrible accent, by the way. Which brings us to how the stubbornness of one island shaped car markets across the planet. While much of Europe drifted right under French influence, Britain flat out refused. Part of it was pride, doing the opposite of France became almost symbolic patriotism, but part of it was also practical. On narrow country lanes, especially with horses pulling carriages, sticking to the left actually made a lot of sense. Drivers sitting on the right could use their dominant hand to manage the whip while still keeping an eye on oncoming traffic. Then trains came along. Britain was the pioneer in building railways, and they ran those rail lines left-hand oriented too. Signal systems, track layouts, and traffic rules all link it back to the same left-side logic. Once something as complex as rail transport is built on a system, it basically cements national practice. Remember this concept of the infrastructure being built first, because this comes into play later on. Britain exported not just technology but also its standards to colonies around the globe. India, Australia, South Africa, the Caribbean all adopted left-hand traffic along with the rest of British governance. Japan, which already leaned left because of its samurai tradition, doubled down after British engineers built their first railways. This railway influence locked Japan into left-hand traffic permanently. So it started as, we carries the swords this way,
and we carry the swords that way,
reinforced by railways, and finally spread as part of empire building. However, once the industrial era arrived, you'll see why it went from flexible custom to permanent infrastructure almost overnight. The main ringleaders for this movement were the British and the French. But in the 20th century, the US had largely been ignored by industrialization from the French and British empires. So why do American people drive on the right side of the road and have left-hand cars? Enter Henry Ford, one of the most successful businessmen in history and one of the most influential people in American history. See, Ford came out with the Model T, and it wasn't just a car, it was an industrial template. With the moving assembly line, Ford didn't just make cars cheaper, he standardized how they were built. And here's the big point, Ford designed his Model T around right-side driving, meaning the steering wheel went on the left. So you might be wondering, why did Henry Ford choose such a decision? See, in America, most roads didn't have strict rules yet, but wagons were already tending towards driving on the right. Sitting on the left side of the vehicle gave Ford's drivers the best line of sight for passing. And once the Model T exploded in popularity, that decision basically became the American standard overnight. Millions of drivers learned on cars built this way and the infrastructure adapted around them. Now let's consider scale. See, the United States by the 1920s was producing more cars than the rest of the world combined. When American cars were exporting to countries in Central and South America, the left-hand drive format came with them. Road size, traffic codes, and even driver habits adjusted. And once you've got tens of thousands of cars with a specific orientation on the road, flipping to the other side becomes a logistical nightmare. You'd have to rebuild intersections, signage, road markings, and retrain every driver at once. In the America's case, the infrastructure was built around the cars, not the other way around. However, in the rest of the world, the infrastructure was set before the cars, such as in Japan or in Britain. And from that point on, it stopped being cultural and patriotic and just became structural and functional. And it's crazy to think that today half the world runs left-hand drive because of Ford and Napoleon, and the other half sticks with the British legacy. Which brings us to your JDM headache right now. See, Japanese cars are one of the most sought-after cars in the market. I have a video explaining exactly why they're good, check that out. They have great condition, most importantly they have an extremely low price. However, these cars are basically locked because of the side of the road they drive on. See, Japan ended up firmly locked into left-hand traffic, partly from samurai traditions and fully cemented by British railway engineers, and later mirrored in its domestic car industry. That's why today's GDM cars, from Skylines to Silvias to Toyota Crowns, are almost exclusively built with a steering wheel on the right. The problem is that most of the car buying world, especially North America and Europe outside the UK, drives on other systems. Importing a right-hand drive JDM car means dealing with safety regulations, visibility issues, insurance headaches, and sometimes outright bans. All these costs pile up, and cars that are everyday drivers in Japan suddenly turn into expensive collector items abroad. So when you see a great listing in Japan, you'll realize why it isn't in your driveway. It was because of the divide set centuries ago. So here's the ironic truth. The reason you can't grab that cheap Skyline from Japan and daily it with no problems has nothing to do with engines or emissions or Japanese engineers. It's because of samurai habits. Napoleon's ego, Britain's refusal to follow, and Henry's Ford assembly line. What started with knights and swords became codified by law, spread through the empire, and locked down by industrial mass production. That's why the wheel is on the right in Tokyo, on the left in Detroit, and why importing across the divide is still complicated. It's a wild chain when you think about it. A French general marching armies, a British empire exporting rail networks, and an American businessman obsessed with efficiency all conspired to make sure traffic never fully aligned. The global split in driving sides is more than just an inconvenience, it's history sitting in your driver's seat. So the next time you're browsing JDM imports and muttering about regulation, remember who to blame. Not your local DMV, not Japanese engineers, blame a fucking French guy from 200 years ago. And if you want more breakdowns of how car culture is shaped by weird twists of history, hit subscribe.